We are coming to the end of my series on the book of Acts after over a year in it. So I don't know if you'll be sorry about that or relieved. But either way, it is coming to an end. We're in chapter 27 today, and then I have two more sessions after this in chapter 28, and then I'll have to think of something new to talk about after that. Don't worry, I have ideas. The next sermon I'll preach is next week, and then we're going to be in Hawaii with a number of you that are going along on the Trilogy trip that Mary Ellen put together for us. It's really great. And so I won't actually do that last session in Acts until November 10th. I got that wrong when I talked to you, Jay. So it'll actually be November 10th. We'll get to that one. I'm going to keep you waiting for the big finish. But today we're going to talk about anchors in the shipwrecks of life. And the topic of this is Paul's journey to Rome, where he has he's appealed to Caesar, and now he has to be taken there. And this is the journey itself. Paul sails for Rome. So what I'm going to do is, in place of where I'd normally have an opening story, I want to tell the story of this journey up to the point where we're really going to focus in on the passage, on what happens. In outside of Malta, the actual shipwreck that does occur. But I won't tell you what happens to the shipwreck until later, so I'm going to keep suspense. So it starts out with Paul and some other prisoners being escorted by a centurion named Julius to Rome. Now, they don't have their own ship. So the centurion and the Roman guards, even though they're the Romans who are in charge of everything, he doesn't have his own ship. He has to get on board, has to basically book passage on other ships to get from Palestine to Rome. And there's no ship that goes directly from Palestine to Rome. It's like all those connections you have to make, you know. So there's no ship that goes directly between these. So he has to sail up the coast here from where Paul is in Caesarea up to Sidon, where he picks up a ship and then is going to head up around Cyprus to Myra on the coast of Asia Minor. The ship is a ship out of the city of Adramatium. If you look in Acts 27, it calls it an Adramatium ship, and that's why. It's just a big port on the coast that had its own ships. So the ship sails from Asia, from the coast of Palestine up to there. And then he transferred, the centurion with his prisoners, transferred to an Egyptian grain ship. These were the container ships of the ancient world. You know, if you look at, you can actually go online and you can see where all the container ships are between us and China and Taiwan. It's just, it's just like all these dots all over the Pacific, just back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. Every few weeks they make this journey back and forth. The ship that Paul was on probably carried something like 1,000 tons of grain. I think it's 2 million pounds, if I count that right, of grain, plus passengers. One ship, and we don't know exactly the size of Paul's ship, but the big grain ships that were just, because basically Egypt had become the breadbasket of Italy by this point. There was a lot of depopulation through the civil wars in Italy. So even though there was plenty of land to grow grain, there weren't enough farmers, so they were actually importing a lot of grain from Egypt. So these giant ships just back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. The grain ship Isis, which has been discovered and is written about in history, was 180 feet long, 45 feet wide, similar in size to the USS Constitution from the early days of America. So much smaller than the container ships of today, but you know they were just huge behemoths, as big as they knew how to build a ship. They built these ships to carry grain. So Paul is on that. This is a reconstruction of a ship. It's not as big as the grain ship would have been, but it shows you a little bit of how the Romans constructed a cargo ship. So with difficulty, we're told, due to winds that were whipping up, they were able to make it on this grain ship from the coast of Asia Minor to Fair Havens, the Fair Havens port on the island of Crete. And the problem is, because of the winds, this wasn't a great time to sail. is coming to the end of the season where they would sail the Mediterranean. Yom Kippur was over, and so it was about mid-October in the year 59. We think, we know that Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, was October 3rd of that year. It was October 5th, I think. I've got it right. 5th, do you know, of this year, Day of Atonement. And so almost the same. It moves around because of the lunar calendar that Jewish feast days are based on. But it was about the same time of the year. So it was right about now that they are stuck in Crete. And in the Mediterranean, traditionally ships who sailed the Mediterranean, they didn't have our navigation, they didn't have GPS, they didn't have, modern conveniences, and so they kind of hugged the coast. Or at least whenever they sailed in sight of the coast. And that's how they kept their bearings. Very, primitive by our standards, but that's the best they could do. And they generally did not sail between November 1st and March 1st. So they're right at the tail end. And so Paul says to the captain, says to the centurion who's, his in charge of him, he says, guys, I think we really should just stick in Fair Havens. We shouldn't try to get any further and just weather it out, just, ride out the winter. So that means several months waiting until they could sail further, but it's the safe thing to do. Well, they didn't listen to him. They had a schedule, and so they just kept going. Paul says to them, based on what the Lord has revealed to him, I promise great loss if you try to continue. So verse 10 of chapter 27, Paul said, listen to me, guys. Take me seriously. They didn't, and they kept going. They thought, well, if we could just make it from Fair Havens to Phoenix. Some of you think Phoenix is in Arizona. It's on Crete. Yeah. Rumors of the heat of Arizona is... But this is the original city of Phoenix in the ancient world. And it did have a much nicer port than Fair Havens where they could weather the storm. The problem is they're heading off here. A nor'easter blows across the island and blows them out to sea, and they can't make port. And we think, wait a minute, just turn on the motors. Yeah, right. Yeah. No motors. These are sailing ships. They're not like the battleships that they had, which were actually... had a bunch of rowers. You had dozens of guys rowing, and you could go any direction you wanted if you rowed hard enough. But these were sailing ships, so they have to go where the wind takes them. So they were blown out to sea, out to the Mediterranean. So they've got a problem because they're afraid that they're heading for the coast of Libya. Right off the coast of Libya was a very hazardous area of the Mediterranean. It was kind of like the what do I want to say? Thank you. How did you know that? Did I tell you that when we were talking? It's like the Bermuda Triangle of the Mediterranean. You did not want to go there because too many people never came back out when they ended up there in bad weather. So they had to do something about that. And again, this is not the right ship. They didn't have oars, but it's a ship in a storm. So, you think you could find anything on the internet, but it turns out you can't. So they had to let the wind direct the ship because, that's all they could do. With a sailing ship, that's it. The big ships, like the grain ship, had a harbor boat that they towed behind them. So, in normal weather, that's fine. When it gets this bad, that harbor ship's going to pound into your ship and break you up. So you tow it, you pull it up on board, and just keep going. They strung rope underneath the ship to gird, basically, probably, we don't really know what they were doing. It's pretty amazing. The scholars even today aren't sure, but they were putting ropes under it. They know they did it. It's not only in Acts, we're told that. We think maybe they're kind of trying to tie the timbers together, all these they're all made of wood timbers, so they're trying to keep them from breaking apart. But they've done that because they're getting anxious. And then they lower a drift anchor to slow the ship down. So anchors in the ancient world did a lot of different things. You would use them in a harbor to anchor you in one spot, but you'd also use them to just slow you down, to drag along if you're coming up on a coast, especially, or in a storm, and you're trying to just slow your progress. That's about all you can do. They're putting on the brakes, do the best that they could, and they were hoping that this anchor would slow them down and also send them north of the Bermuda Triangle, or the Mediterranean Triangle. They lightened the ship by dumping cargo and the ship's tackle in verse 19. Not the grain yet, because that's the big prize, and it's a lot of money, and it's probably worth the captain's life if he gets rid of the grain And then they managed to make it safely to shore, and yet his cargo's empty. So they're dumping everything else that they can. And the ship's tackle is probably extra equipment, that they weren't needing for that particular trip. They didn't know where they were for days on end because of the weather, because they're navigating by sight, sun by day, stars by night. The weather's bad enough, you can't see any of that stuff. So all hope was lost. And now, I'm going to leave you at that point for a minute. Tell you the rest of the story in a minute. Today I want to mention three anchors of hope that we can cast in the storms of life. Three anchors that God has promised to us and that we see Paul cast on behalf of the people on this ship. First of all, we can show confidence in God's presence because we know that God is present no matter how things are. No matter my lot, thou hast taught me to say, it is well with my soul. And we can have that confidence. Secondly, we can give practical help. When you keep your head in a crisis, when all around you are losing theirs, from the famous poem If by Rudyard Kipling, he wrote for his son, if you can keep your head when everyone else is losing theirs, you stand alone. I mean, you're pretty unusual. And yet, with the confidence we have in God's help, we can be calm enough that we can offer practical help in the midst of storms and shipwrecks of life. Thirdly, we can demonstrate absolute faith, no matter evidence to the contrary, that God is still in control. He may be allowing things to happen to us that are unpleasant, but He's still in charge. And if He's promised that He'll protect us, then He will do so. That's tremendous anchors that Paul is able to provide for the people on that poor ship. And we can do that for those around us. First of all, we can show confidence in God's presence. Well, this is the low point of the journey. They had gone days without food, according to verse 21 of Acts 27. And it's not because they didn't have food. They clearly had food they could eat. But they just couldn't bring themselves to eat. Anxiety, seasickness, for whatever reason, they have gone a long period without eating. And Paul says we've got to, at this point, he points out that his earlier warning is coming true. He does say, I told you so. Fortunately, he doesn't stop with that. Some of us get that point, and that's all we have to offer. But, he says, I did predict this would happen. You guys should have listened to me and stayed in Fair Havens. But he says, even though we're going to lose the ship, there's no doubt about that, we can't avoid loss of life. God has told me, an angel has appeared to me and revealed to me that if you follow my lead, we can avoid any loss of life, even though the ship is going to be a loss. So in verses 23 through 25, Paul tells them, and an angel has assured him of this. There was a certain amount of superstition in the ancient world. There were probably a lot of people who, although not Christians, were inclined to want to believe Paul, that an angel had appeared to him and assured him of their safety. Others would be skeptical of that. This is verse 25 from Acts 27. Therefore, keep up your courage, Paul says, men, for I believe God that it will turn out exactly as I have been told. But we must run aground on a certain island, which will end up being Malta. So he says, I have great confidence. He exhibits that confidence, that leadership. When you show confidence to people in a crisis, it's very likely that at least at first they're going to doubt you. They're going to poo-poo your confidence. Oh, how could anyone know that? But so part of that confidence that we have in the Lord is to stay confident even though people around us disagree, even though they aren't reassured at first. By demonstrating that confidence as things continue to be bad, people start saying, well, maybe he knows something we don't know. Maybe God has spoken to him. Maybe we should listen to him. So hanging in, being faithful in our confidence is important. We may not have received a word from God about the future. We may not be able to say that an angel has appeared to us and said, everyone's going to be okay if you just do what I say. I think that typically is the case. We don't have that confidence. But we do know that God never deserts us. God won't desert us. If your sense of God's presence is strong, you just need to be yourself in front of others to encourage them. And so as believers, the important thing, this is why our maturity in Christ is so important. In a time of crisis, it's not about pretending to be more confident than you really are, because people will see through that. It's being the truly confident person in God's love and presence and compassion that you always are, that external circumstances don't matter. God never changes no matter how things look around us at any given time. When we have that kind of confidence, people take note, and it makes a difference. Not for all of them, but as we'll see with Paul, certainly for some. Deuteronomy 31:8. The Lord is the one who goes ahead of you. He will be with you. He will not fail you or forsake you. Do not fear or be dismayed. This was Moses' message to the people of Israel, and it's repeated or referenced in Hebrews 13. For he himself has said, I will never desert you, nor will I ever forsake you. So, the author of Hebrews says, so that we confidently say, the Lord is my helper, I will not be afraid. What will man do to me? What can he do when God is on my side? That's the kind of confidence that we should always have in the Lord, and especially in times of crisis. Well, I'm talking about anchors, and of course metaphorical anchors, but anchors were, and it became an important early Christian symbol. Anyone know when the cross became the symbol of Christianity? 4th century. Under Constantine, yeah. So 300 years later, before the cross is a symbol of Roman execution. It would be like making the hangman's noose the symbol of Christianity. So, we'd have to think twice about that. And the church did. So it would be a long time before the cross becomes the symbol of the church. But once crucifixion is ended, and once it's only a distant memory, it became a little easier to think of the cross as a symbol of Christ's sacrifice. But before that, the anchor is one of the big symbols, not the only one, but one of the big symbols. It's throughout the catacombs. These are all images from the Christian catacombs, from the some go back to the 1st century, 2nd, 3rd century. So this is the classic shape of the anchor. Now this one, the anchor has fish, because another big symbol of early Christianity is a fish or fishes. It refers to Christ. The Greek ichthus became the acronym Jesus Christ, Son of God, Savior. Each letter of ichthus spells that out in Greek. And so Jesus represents the fish in that respect. But also the followers of Jesus then were represented as the little fishes, the little followers of Christ. So that's why you'll have multiple fish sometimes. So you see the combination of the anchor and the fish they didn't use anchors to fish, so they weren't catching fish with anchors, but it's a combination of these two. So the anchor represented safety. Hebrews 6:19. This hope we have as an anchor of the soul, a hope both sure and steadfast. And of course, this is the hope that Christ's sacrifice has atoned for us and provided salvation for us. And so the symbol of God's provision for us as an anchor that anchors us steadfast and in our hope for the future is a powerful symbol in Christianity. Which brings me to the second anchor, the anchor of practical help. And we can give practical help. So Paul and these folks are 14 days into the storm. Now, have you ever been on a cruise ship when there was a storm? Right? But that's nothing like these people thought they were going to die, and they weren't eating. And so, sometimes it's hard to hit that midnight buffet when, there's a little bit of rocking at night. But going without food for days on end, that's a lot of anxiety. Finally, they're approaching land, and they know that. They can't see anything, but they're taking soundings, and the depth of the ocean's getting, less and less, and so that means they know they're coming up on land somehow. And it is the island of Malta, though they have no idea what it is. They cast 4 anchors now because they want to avoid running aground. They don't want to be shoved up on a shoal or something or too quickly because of the danger of that. And so they're trying to, they're dragging 4 anchors to try to slow themselves down and make sure that when they finally get to a shore, they're not, coming too fast. Paul tells the centurion to keep the crew from escaping the ship. So what happens in this part of the passage is the crew is getting panicky as they see that they're getting closer to a shore, and yet they tell it, but they can't see it. They don't know what it is, when it's coming. So they're going to get on that boat, that harbor boat, and they're going to escape. And Paul sees this and realizes if we lose the crew, the only ones who know how to do anything with this ship, we're all sunk, literally. So he tells the centurion, you have got to make sure the captain doesn't let these guys go. So, in fact, he doesn't. He has the harbor ship cut away and just, cast away so that they can't escape. Keeps them on the ship. They were not happy about that. And Paul encourages all to eat and have hope. He says, not a hair from the head of any of you will perish. Not a hair will perish. Some of you who have lost your hair wish God had made that promise earlier, but go any further with that. So, in fact, they are encouraged. They take food, or Paul takes food. So he also not only encourages them to eat, but he starts eating. He demonstrates, he says, join me. And he takes food, he gives thanks to God, and eats before all to demonstrate, see, I'm confident that we're going to be okay, and you should be too. And it works. The rest of them, 276 people on this ship, are encouraged to eat. And I just want to mention, 276 people on a grain ship. This was common. Although the ship is designed to transport grain back and forth, it's huge. And it's not that big of a deal when they got 1,000 tons of grain to throw a couple hundred people on as well. It wasn't that big of a deal. So these are, pretty good-sized ships. And it was just extra income, for the shipping line that they had passengers as well. So they're encouraged and they eat. Unfortunately, Paul wasn't on this ship. But remember the Costa Concordia disaster? This is not how you want your cruise ship to look. It was an Italian cruise ship that sailed too close to an island. They were showing off. They were doing a sail-by for members of the cruise line, I guess. They were really too close to the shore, to the island, and struck a rock and sank on January 13th, 2012. 32 people died. It's a terrible disaster. The captain was blamed for poor navigation, was finally, after a long trial, convicted of manslaughter for deserting 300 passengers to save himself. He got in that harbor ship, as it were, their version of that ship, and sailed off, the same thing those sailors wanted to do with Paul, and left those poor folks to fend for themselves. They needed a Paul. They needed somebody on that ship, even if it wasn't the captain, to say, all right, guys, we got this. We can, if we hang together, we can survive this. But people panicked. It was so sad. People sometimes say, those Christians, they're so heavenly minded, they're no earthly good. Well, we can be both. We can be heaven. In fact, our heavenly mindedness, if that means that we are confident in God's presence, if we're confident that God cares and will provide, that can make us of a lot of earthly good. Unlike the security monitor at the Florida high school shooting back last year, this terrible shooting in Florida, they've talked about there was a guard, that was supposed to be, was an armed guard supposed to be protecting, and he ran away, oh no, don't go in, while he's hearing. Well, there was other people who also failed. There were 2 security monitors who saw the shooter enter the school, and they knew he was trouble. They knew him. The school had talked about him, that he was bad news. And yet, they didn't stop him. One guy saw him. He radioed to the other guy, the second guy, and they don't have any, weapons. They had radios and they had cell phones. The second guy hears that this kid with trouble is carrying a bag, a duffel bag, is coming into the school. And what does he do? He hides in a closet. And he hides in a closet, and he doesn't even use his radio to call. And the shooting starts, and he's hiding. And then, because he hasn't radioed in and said, hey, we saw this kid, and he must be the one shooting. Because that hadn't been done, they pulled a fire alarm. They called a fire alarm, thinking that must be the problem. It's a fire. Or what was it? Maybe the kid pulled a fire alarm. The shooter pulled the fire alarm. But they took it as a real alarm, a real fire, because this monitor hadn't called in and said, very practically, we've got a shooter on campus. We've got an active shooter. If that had been the case, the teachers would have ignored the fire alarm and kept the kids in the rooms because they all come flooding out into the corridor where the shooter is. And it's more, it would have been less of a disaster if they hadn't come flooding out. So security monitor who was of absolutely no practical help in that, it just breaks your heart. We're able to keep our heads in a crisis when we are truly confident in God's presence, love, and power. If we're just playing church, if we're just playing being a Christian and it's not for real, then we're not going to be of any help in a crisis. But if you have felt God's presence in a powerful way, if you know that he helped you not only in good times, but in bad, in critical emergencies, then you can be of a tremendous practical benefit to the people in that time. We can have the presence of mind to care and to lead others in such times. And hopefully you can. Hopefully you'll be able to. In some ways, we just don't know until we face it, whether we have that kind of faith or not. Thirdly, we can demonstrate absolute faith in front of the people who are facing those problems. So the ship does get stuck, as they feared. It does get stuck on a shoal, a ways from shore, not too far, and it starts to break up. So the front end is stuck and the back end is doing this, and ships don't bend very well. They're not designed to be flexible. So it starts breaking up and people start panicking. But Paul's absolute faith that God would save them all was contagious. This guy is so sure, and he's predicted what's happened up to this point. He must know something we don't. I guess we should listen to him. The centurion trusted Paul. And so the prisoners decided, hey, this is the end. We better kill the prisoners now, because if they escape, we'll be killed. You didn't let a prisoner get away if you valued your life in those days. And so the soldiers say, check one on procedure list is kill the prisoners. And Paul convinced them that was not right, that we would all be saved, that this isn't the end. We can be saved. Don't kill the prisoners. Of course, he's one of the prisoners, but, there were others as well. And all make it safely to the shore of Malta. Some are able to swim. Others, holding on to, pieces of wood, are able to kind of paddle their way to shore. And every person is saved, just as Paul had predicted. Well, we discover how strong our faith is in a crisis. That's one reason God lets us endure crises, so that we have the opportunity. It's training. We have the opportunity to see God. Yeah, God really does love us, even in a crisis. God is present. He hasn't left us. He never forsakes us. How we face ordeals impacts how others view God and his servants far more than any words we can say. So again, if you say, why does God let me go through this? Why is he letting me suffer in this way? It may be that giving you the opportunity to be a witness to his presence, to his love and his power before others who would otherwise panic, who would otherwise feel like they were on their own. And God is training you right now. Whatever you're going through, it's not just for that purpose. There are other reasons that God allows calamity into our lives. It's one of the reasons. There are many others, and we never really know for sure exactly what God is doing in our lives through the things that we face. We'd all love to be like that cruise ship out on a calm, lovely Mediterranean, and it usually is like that. In the same way that many of us, our lives are usually like the calm Mediterranean, but those storms will whip up. November 1st comes in our lives, and the storms whip up, and we have to sail out to sea, even though we'd rather stay home in winter. And for a few months. And God is present in all of those circumstances. And if we've experienced that to the degree that we have experienced that, we can share that with other people. We can encourage them. We can strengthen their faith if they're believers. We can give testimony to God's greatness if they don't know him already, and help them find a path towards faith. Let's close in prayer. Father, we thank you that we know that you are always present. And in many ways, when the world around us gets dimmer and with less hope, your presence shines through even more. Father, I pray that we might have that kind of faith, that you might build in us the faith that says, that not only can we be assured of God's presence, but we can assure those around us. We can be a testimony to God's love. We can become not focused on our own skin, on saving ourselves, but we can be focused on others who have such need for you, and we can encourage them and love them towards finding you. We offer these things to you with our thanksgiving in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.